I speak in the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. He came to himself and said, I will arise and go to my Father. Here's a great parable that really tells itself. No need for commentary, let alone a sermon. Its message, of course, is quite clear. God is a loving Father, and when our lives fall apart and we are utterly lost, we can with great confidence come back to him, knowing that he'll welcome us home unconditionally. And indeed, that is partly what this parable's about. And after all, from the birth stories right through to the cross and beyond, the Gospel of Luke goes out of its way to place great stress on God's bias to the poor. Jesus, the friend of our frailty. This parable, like the Good Samaritan, is only found in Luke, as are many others. And that's no surprise, because those two parables, very familiar even still in our culture, capture so well those themes of frailty and grace, of Jesus' love for us, warts and all, that run throughout Luke's Gospel. But there's quite a lot more going on here, and although in a sense it's a really obvious parable to preach on, just want to explore that a little further. First, to note that this parable doesn't stand alone, and nor just in relationship to another parable like the Good Samaritan. In fact, it's the climax of three parables in a row. So Luke is saying, this is the teaching of Jesus, you really can't miss it. First, the lost sheep, leave the 99 and go in search of the one who is lost. Secondly, the lost coin. A woman's lost her coin and she sweeps the room until she finds one and then has a party to celebrate. And the lost son, the parable for today. Now, I know that this parable is traditionally known as the prodigal son. And indeed, Henri Nouwen, if you want a book to read for Lent, his book on the prodigal son is a truly remarkable series of reflections. Do you think it's a really unhelpful word? And typical that in churches we keep the kind of odd words. Because I think many people, because the word prodigal is not a very obvious word in modern English, think it means prodigious, which it is related to, or lost, because that's what the parable's about. But of course the word prodigal means wasteful. The wasteful son, because of what he does with his father's wealth. But that's not really the main crux of the passage. I mean, he has been very wasteful. In Deuteronomic law, the part of the property that will be his is a third of his father's wealth. And he's got through that pretty rapidly. But the waste is not really the point. His degradation is. And that he's lost is what Luke wants to communicate. There's a lot going on here. And all sorts of detail. He really is lost. He's gone to a far country. Now for us that might mean Scotland or, I don't know, Eastern Europe. But Luke's telling us a bit more there, or rather Jesus is telling us a bit more there. He's gone beyond the boundaries of Israel. He's among pagans. He's among people who do not share the faith community he comes from. And Jesus rams that home by telling us that detail that he's sent out to feed the pigs. Because, of course, pigs in Judaism to this day are utterly unclean. They will defile somebody who has anything to do with them. So he's completely left, not just his father's house, but his religious tradition, his culture, and all the relationships that make that up. And then in this beautiful line at the heart of it, he comes to himself. He's far from home, lost in a foreign land. He comes to himself. I will arise, he says. Now, there are quite a lot of words in Greek for getting up. The one used here is the resurrection word. I will rise up. Same word used of Jesus' resurrection later on. And I will go to my Father. And then what follows is that beautiful encounter. The Father running out to meet him. My son who was lost is found, was dead, is alive again. And I know in some churches, because I think the gospel reading just goes on a bit too long today, they stop there. But of course that's not the crux of the story. Yes, it's a really important part of the story, but there's a sting in the tail. We need always to place things in proper context. And here, the context is made absolutely clear by those first few verses printed in your booklet. Jesus is telling this story not as a random piece of preaching, but to a very specific audience. He's telling it in response to the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious professionals of his day, challenging him. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. That's in verse 2. So Jesus is hanging around with the wrong kind of people. And Jesus is not simply telling them a story about how a lost son is welcomed home and his elder brother gets angry in response. That would be fine. And we could gently identify ourselves with the lost son coming home, or maybe with the father in his generosity. But Jesus is saying something more. Consorting with tax collectors and sinners and eating with them. Well, that's a bit what's ended up with the lost son, isn't it? Jesus becomes ritually unclean by consorting with people who are outsiders, who are literally beyond the pale. He has literally and metaphorically defiled himself by the social relationships he's established. He's broken social and religious taboos. And of course, that's hardly unsurprising, because that's a feature of Jesus' words and actions from the very beginning of the gospel onwards. It's a very interesting moment. At 9:30, our girl bishop, Freya, preached, and she used a line in that sermon, which is straight out of the commentaries. Remember that Mary was an unmarried 14-year-old having a baby. Apparently, when she tried that out on a friend of hers, they were deeply shocked. Said, "You can't possibly say that in church." Freya said, but that's the gospel. It's what it says. And of course, she did say it in church. That strange thing that we still got these weird taboos in our heads about what this is all for. So Jesus, the one who shares his table with lost people, now tells the Pharisees and the scribes, not the crowd, a very specific group of religious leaders, he tells them a story in which this lost son, who is lost in multiple ways, stands for all those lost, defiled, despised tax collectors and sinners whom Jesus has literally and metaphorically invited to sit at his table and eat with him. This is dramatic and challenging at a much deeper level than the lovely idea of Dad saying, "Come home, all is forgiven." Indeed, one of the most extraordinary things about Jesus is that he has no red lines that people aren't allowed to cross. He doesn't ask anything of anyone. All are welcome completely without distinction. It's very clear in the Gospels, and if we miss that, then in Galatians and Romans, Paul says the same. You don't have to be worthy or good. You can never earn your place in heaven. That's God's free gift. Of course, Jesus does long for us to respond in lives and love and service, of course. But who we are and what we have or have not done is no barrier to us having full access to Jesus. I think it's one of the most shocking things about the gospel. He doesn't say, "Oh, if you just behave a bit better, you can be my friend." Okay, he wants people to behave better and respond, but there is no barrier to access to Jesus. All are welcome without distinction. So the crux of this passage in context, because this is pretty offensive to the Pharisees and scribes, they say, yeah, there are loads of barriers, loads of thresholds. You can't just come in here and think you belong. And Jesus is completely undermining a whole theological position and spiritual position. The crux of the passage is what Jesus says next, when he tells the story of the angry elder brother and his resentment at the way his lost younger sibling has been welcomed home unconditionally. The parable turns out not to be about one son, but two. Jesus is saying to the respectable, law-abiding, commandment-keeping, temple-going, generous tithing, righteous, moral scribes and Pharisees, and they are indeed all those things. The Gospels are the only piece of ancient literature that paint the Pharisees as baddies. Well, because Jesus is prodding their hypocrisy. That's the word he uses them. You hypocrites, he says to the scribes and the Pharisees. He's saying that they are the elder brother, resentful because God in his reckless generosity chooses to love the dossers and the wasters. And that Jesus is so committed to this that he will even invite the dossers and wasters to sit at table with him, to be his companions, a word that means breaking bread with people. Jesus' actions are not for us, of course, because we're so cool about this stuff, but in the context of the Gospels, so transgressive. So transgressive. A bit like making you despise Samaritan, the hero of a story about a man who gets beaten up and then is ignored by religious officials. Oh no, he tells that one too, doesn't he? Oh dear, so a despised foreigner, non-Jew, does the right thing when the priest and the Levite don't. So these are immensely transgressive, disruptive discourses seeking to challenge, well, Jesus' hearers. Jesus' hearers. And who are his hearers? Well, this morning it's us. He wants us to be disrupted by this extraordinary good news of an undefended God. Of course, Jesus here makes a general point about God's preferential option for the poor and invites us to join in that work. But in the resentful elder brother, and if you know the picture by Rembrandt, people regard it as the greatest picture Rembrandt ever painted, the way the elder brother is pictured, look it up on Google or something, it's just a brilliant insight into precisely this choreography, really. The resentful elder brother, Jesus holds up as a mirror to the scribes and the Pharisees, and therefore holds up as a mirror to us and asks how we measure up. He asks us to look at our own lives, especially in Lent, and seek to root out the instincts of the elder brother, or all that poison that we find there, especially in some of those close relationships, but also in every part of our lives. To have the grace to hear our Father's invitation to come on in and join the party, to welcome that waster of a brother back home. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.